I walked out of my son's house on my 70th birthday and I didn't cry until I got to my car. Then I sat in the driveway for 3 minutes, told myself I was done, and drove home. 2 weeks later, I changed my will. I want to explain how I got there. Not for sympathy. I'm 68 years old. I was 68 then, and I've lived long enough to know that sympathy doesn't fix anything. I'm telling this because I think some of you have been where I was, standing on a doorstep that used to be yours, holding a casserole dish that nobody wanted, wondering how a person ends up a stranger to her own child. And I want you to know what happens when you finally stop trying to earn your way back in. My son's name is Scott. He's 41. He works in commercial real estate, which he'll tell you about within 5 minutes of meeting him, not because he's passionate about it, but because he needs you to know he's successful. His wife is Kristen. I tried with Kristen for 12 years. I want to be honest about that. I genuinely tried. She's not an easy woman to love, but I didn't need to love her. I just needed us to find a way to coexist for the sake of Scott and for the sake of their 2 boys, Eli and Connor, who are 9 and 12 and had nothing to do with any of this. Before all of it fell apart, I would have described my life as quiet and full. I retired 4 years ago from 31 years as a high school librarian in Dayton, Ohio. My husband passed in 2019, heart attack, sudden, no warning, and I won't pretend that didn't hollow me out for a while. But I had my routines, my garden, my Thursday morning book club, and a small but solid circle of women who had known me long enough to tell me the truth. I wasn't lonely. I want to make that clear, because I think people assume that older women who live alone must be desperate for family connection, must be so starved for belonging that they'll accept any scraps offered. I wasn't. I had a life. I simply loved my son and wanted to be part of his. The distance started, I think, when I said something honest. It was Easter. 2 years before my birthday. Kristen had made a comment at the dinner table. Scott's sister Patricia was there with her husband and both boys about how I'd rearranged the living room the last time I visited. I had. I moved a side table about 2 feet because you had to turn sideways to get past it, which I mentioned to Scott, and he'd laughed and said, "Go ahead." Kristen brought it up in front of everyone, her voice light and her eyes sharp, saying she'd come home to find her house rearranged by someone who didn't live there. I apologized. I meant it. But then she said, "It's a pattern, really. You have trouble with boundaries." I put down my fork. I said, "I think we're describing 2 different things. Moving a table because your son asked me to isn't a boundary issue, but I'm happy to discuss it privately if something's been bothering you." The table went silent. Patricia looked at her plate. Scott looked at Kristen. Kristen smiled the way people smile when they want you to know they're not going to forget this. That was the beginning. After that, invitations slowed. The Sunday calls dropped to once every 2 weeks, then once a month. When I drove up to see the boys for Connor's soccer tournament that fall, I arrived to find that the time had been changed without anyone telling me. I stood on the sideline for 20 minutes before I figured out which field they were on, and when I found Scott and Kristen in the stands, Kristen said, "Oh, I thought Scott texted you." Scott was already watching the field. I started noticing the pattern of small erasures. A birthday dinner moved to a night I hadn't been told about. A Christmas photo on social media with a caption about the whole family that did not include me. Holiday plans mentioned in passing, already finalized, with no space left where I might fit. None of it was dramatic. None of it was something you could hold up and say, "Look, here, this is what they did." It was the accumulation of it, the quiet, consistent message that I was optional. I mentioned it to Scott once. We were on the phone in February, about 6 months before my birthday, and I asked him directly, "Are you and Kristen upset with me about something?" I asked calmly. I wasn't accusing. I wanted to understand. He said, "Mom, Kristen just needs her space. She's been stressed." I asked, "For 2 years?" He didn't answer that. I had turned 68 in March and turned 70 that July. I know that sounds wrong. I say 68, and then 70, but I mean I'd been 68 when the Easter thing happened, and I turned 69 the following spring, and then finally 70 that July. The birthday I'm talking about was my 70th. I want to be precise because it matters to me, the timeline. I want you to understand this wasn't a snap decision. Was it me overreacting to one bad night? This was 2 years of watching my son choose his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity, and deciding that was information I needed to take seriously. My daughter-in-law planned a party for Scott's 40th the previous October. Big backyard gathering, catered, string lights, a photo booth. I was there. I helped. I brought a platter of the deviled eggs that Scott has loved since he was 8 years old, and I stood in the corner most of the night, making polite conversation with people I didn't know, while Kristen's parents were treated like the guests of honor. I watched her mother link her arm through Scott's and pose for pictures, and I told myself it was fine. He was her son-in-law. Families overlap. I drove home that night and said to my cat, "You are the only one in this house who is reliably glad to see me," and I laughed, but it sat with me. When my 70th approached, I mentioned it to Scott in May. Just mentioned it, that it was a milestone, that I'd love to do something to mark it. He said, "Of course, Mom, we'll figure something out." I waited. I didn't push. In June, I asked if he had anything in mind. He said Kristen had been really busy with her new job and they'd been stretched thin. I said I understood completely. I said even just dinner, the 5 of us, would mean a lot to me. July came. My birthday is the 14th. By the 10th, I had heard nothing. I called Scott. He didn't answer. I texted. He replied 4 hours later. "We haven't forgotten, Mom. Kristen's been dealing with a lot. Maybe we can do something the following weekend." I put the phone down. I sat in my kitchen for a long time. My friend Dorothy, not from the list, my friend from book club, I'm using her name because she'd want me to. She called that evening to wish me an early happy birthday, and I told her what was happening, and she said, "Sweetheart, you are allowed to show up for yourself." So I did. I baked my own birthday cake. Lemon with cream cheese frosting, the same cake my mother made for me every year until she died. I put it in the car on the morning of the 14th alongside a small gift bag. I'd bought myself a first edition I'd been eyeing for months, and I drove to Scott's house. I told myself I wasn't going to make it about anything. I just wanted to see my grandchildren. I wanted Eli and Connor to hug me and eat cake and blow out a candle with me, and then I would go home. I knocked. Kristen opened the door. She looked at me for a moment. Just a beat, but I caught it. And then she said, "We weren't expecting you." I said, "I know, I thought I'd stop by. It's my birthday." She said, "Scott's not here. He had a thing for work." I said, "That's okay. I'd love to see the boys if they're home." She crossed her arms. She was wearing a sundress and the expression of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was ready. She said, "I really think you should have called first. This is my home, and I have a right to know when someone's going to show up." I said, "You're right. I'm sorry I didn't call. I was hoping to surprise the boys on my birthday." She said, "Look, I've been very patient. I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, but you have a habit of just inserting yourself, and it's not okay. Today is not a good day." I looked past her into the hallway. I could see Connor at the top of the stairs. He was watching. He lifted one hand in a small wave, and I lifted mine back. Kristen stepped slightly into the doorframe. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about the Easter dinner and the soccer tournament and the October party where I stood in the corner with my deviled eggs, and every quiet Sunday that had dissolved without explanation, and my son saying, "She's just been stressed for 2 years straight." I said, "All right, please tell the boys I love them." I picked up my cake. I walked back to my car. I heard the door close behind me before I'd made it 3 steps. I sat in the driveway. The cake was in my lap. The gift bag was on the passenger seat. I started the car. I drove to Patricia's house, Scott's sister, 15 minutes away. She opened the door, and I held up the cake and said, "It's my birthday, and I have nowhere to be." She started crying before I did. We ate the whole cake at her kitchen table, and her husband Chester told the same bad joke 3 times, and I laughed every time because that is the luxury of being around people who actually love you. I did not call Scott that day. I did not text. I waited to see how long it would take him to realize what had happened. He called 4 days later. He'd heard from Patricia. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were going to come by." I said, "I know you did it." He said, "Kristen said it was uncomfortable, that you just showed up." I said, "Scott, I showed up on my 70th birthday with a cake I baked myself because no one in your family had made any plan to acknowledge it. I was turned away at the door. I'm not angry. I'm telling you what happened." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know we dropped the ball on the birthday thing. I feel bad about that." I said, "I believe you." He said, Kristen and I have been going through some stuff and—" I said, "I know. She's been stressed. You've told me that for 2 years." Another silence. He said, "So what do you want me to do?" I said, "I don't want you to do anything, Scott. I called because you called me. I just want you to understand what happened." What I didn't say, what I had already decided sitting in Patricia's kitchen with cake crumbs on the table, was that I had spent the drive over there thinking very clearly about what the rest of my life should look like. I thought about my mother, who lived to 84 and spent the last decade of her life making herself small so her difficult daughter-in-law would stay comfortable. I thought about how my mother died having never asked for anything and never received what she deserved. I thought, I am not going to do that. 2 weeks after my birthday, I drove to see my attorney. I had a will in place already. Straightforward, most of my estate to Scott, a portion to Patricia, some to a literacy foundation I'd supported for years. I'd updated it after my husband died. I sat down with my attorney and I told her what I wanted to change. I want to be fair in how I describe this. I didn't cut Scott out entirely. That felt cruel, and I didn't want to be cruel, but I redistributed significantly. I established a trust for Eli and Connor's education, managed by Patricia, with the explicit stipulation that the trust would be administered independently of Scott and Kristen. Whatever happened between me and my son, those boys were going to have their college paid for. I made sure of that, and I didn't leave it to chance or goodwill. I put it in a document. The remainder I divided, a meaningful portion to Patricia outright, an increased gift to the Literacy Foundation, a contribution to my church's senior outreach program, and yes, a smaller percentage to Scott, still present but no longer the majority. My attorney asked if I was sure. I said yes. She said, "This is a significant change." I said, "I know. That's why I'm doing it." I didn't tell anyone except Patricia. I didn't tell Scott. I didn't make announcements. I just went home and had a quiet dinner and watched the news and felt for the first time in a long time like I had done something honest. What happened next was not something I engineered. I want to be clear about that. I didn't set a trap. I didn't wait for it. But about 3 weeks after I saw my attorney, Scott called me on a Saturday morning with a specific request. He and Kristen had been looking at houses. They'd found one, more than they could manage on their own, he said. But the market was right and they wanted to lock it down. He asked if I would be willing to contribute to the down payment. He named a figure. It was substantial. I sat with it for a moment. I thought about the doorstep. I thought about the cake in my lap. I thought about Connor at the top of the stairs lifting his hand to wave at his grandmother who was being turned away from the door. I said, "Scott, I'm not able to do that." He said, "Mom, it would be a loan. We'd pay it back." I said, "I understand. The answer is still no." He pushed a little. He mentioned the boys, the neighborhood, the school district. I said I was sure the house was wonderful, and I hoped they found a way to make it work. He said, "I just thought you always said you wanted to help." I said, "I do want to help. I've set up something for the boys that will help them in a real way when the time comes. That's how I want to contribute." He didn't understand what I meant by that, not then. And I didn't explain. I just said I loved him and I hoped we could have dinner soon, and I hung up. I won't pretend that conversation was easy. I held the phone after I set it down and sat with the feeling of it for a while. There is something that happens when you say no to a child you love, even a grown child, even a child who has hurt you. It doesn't feel like power. It feels like grief. But I had already grieved. I'd been grieving quietly for 2 years. Every time an invitation didn't come, every time a phone call went unanswered, every time I pulled out of a driveway that used to be a place I was welcomed, I'd done the grieving. What I was doing now was something else. I got more deliberate about my own life after that. I started saying yes to things I'd been putting off. I signed up for a watercolor class at the community center, something I'd told myself I'd do when things settled down, which was absurd because nothing was unsettled except my relationship with my son, and that was not going to settle on its own. I went to a conference for retired educators in Columbus that September and sat next to a woman named Faye who taught 8th grade English for 38 years, and we talked for 4 hours straight and exchanged numbers and have spoken every week since. I planned a trip to Savannah with Patricia for October, the first trip I'd taken with her since we were both in our 30s. I'm not going to tell you I stopped missing my grandchildren because I didn't. Eli and Connor are in my heart in a way that doesn't follow logic. I thought about them on their birthdays and sent cards and called and sometimes got through to them and sometimes didn't. I sent Connor a book on astronomy because he'd mentioned space once, 2 years earlier, and it stuck with me. He texted me a week later, texted a 12-year-old, and said it was really cool. I printed out that text. It's on my refrigerator. Scott and I are not estranged. I want to be precise about that, too. We talk, sporadically. Things are careful between us, like furniture rearranged in a room you once knew by heart. I think he knows something shifted. He doesn't know the details of what I changed, not specifically, and I haven't offered to explain. If the day comes when we need to have that conversation, we will. For now, I am treating my relationship with my son the same way I'm treating my remaining years, with honesty about what's real and without pretending. Kristen and I have not spoken since she closed that door. I don't hate her. Hating someone requires a kind of sustained attention I'm not willing to give. I understand that she is a woman who needs a great deal of control over her environment, and that I represented something she couldn't control, and that my son made his choice about how to handle that. I can understand it and still refuse to be diminished by it. Both things are true. My 70th birthday ended at Patricia's kitchen table with bad jokes and cream cheese frosting, and my brother-in-law Chester asking if I wanted more coffee every 7 minutes, as though that were the one thing standing between me and catastrophe. It was the right way to spend it. My 71st birthday is in 3 weeks. I'm going to Savannah with Patricia. We've booked a bed and breakfast on a street lined with those old oak trees, the kind draped in Spanish moss, and we're going to eat shrimp and grits and walk along the river and do nothing in particular. Faye is meeting us on the second day. I have not invited anyone who would need convincing to be glad I was there. That is not a sad ending. I want you to understand that. I spent a long time believing that if I just found the right way to show up, the right amount of effort, the right kind of patience, I could make myself belong in a place I was quietly being asked to leave. I don't believe that anymore. What I believe now is this: you cannot negotiate your way into being loved by someone who has decided not to love you. You can only decide what to do with the life that's in front of you. Mine is still very much in front of me. I sat in that driveway for a long time with a birthday cake in my lap, not crying, just sitting. And I think that's the moment everything became clear to me, not in a dramatic way, not like something broke open, but quietly, the way you finally see a room clearly once the light changes. What happened to me didn't happen overnight. That's the part I want people to understand. Kristen didn't say one cruel thing, and I walked away. Scott didn't fail me once and I rewrote my will. It was 2 years of small erasures, a call not returned, a dinner not mentioned, a doorstep I was made to feel I had no right to stand on, and I absorbed each one, told myself it was stress, told myself to be patient, told myself that love requires accommodation. I was right about that last part. But I had confused accommodation with erasure. I was accommodating my own disappearance. What I did, finally, was simply tell the truth. Not to Scott, to myself. I sat in Patricia's kitchen and I said, out loud, with cake crumbs on the table, this is not a relationship that is going to get better if I try harder. That was not a bitter thought. It was an honest one. And honesty, real honesty, the kind that costs something, is the beginning of everything good that came after. I think about what it took to walk back to my car that day. People might look at it and see defeat. I didn't feel defeated. I felt, for the first time in 2 years, like I was acting with integrity, like my behavior matched what I actually believed, which is that I deserve to be somewhere I'm wanted. That's not pride. That's just self-respect. And self-respect, I've learned, is not something anyone can give you after a certain age. You either claim it or you don't. The decision about my will was not revenge. I want to be clear about that. Revenge would have required me to be angry, and mostly I was just resolved. What I did was align my choices with reality. I looked at the relationships in my life, who showed up, who didn't, who would have stood in that driveway with me, and I made decisions accordingly. I protected my grandsons in the way I could. I honored the people who had honored me. That felt like wisdom, not punishment. What I know now, at 71, sitting here thinking about Savannah and Spanish moss and my friend Faye, who I met at a conference and somehow became one of the most important people in my life, what I know is that the life I have now required me to go through what I went through. The clarity required the pain. I had to stop pretending in order to start living. You can't force someone to see your value. You cannot argue or perform or sacrifice your way into being loved by someone who has decided not to love you. But you can decide, and this is the part that matters, you can decide that their decision about you is not the final word on who you are. I picked up my cake. I drove to my daughter-in-law's house, my real family. I ate the whole thing. That is where the good part starts.